You know nothing about rockets." The young people's laughter echoed in the crowded hall, drawing complicit glances and malicious whispers. The old woman took a deep breath, leaned her cane on the table, and without a word, removed the cloth, hiding her model. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Precise lines, yellowed calculations, and incomprehensible symbols appeared before everyone. A professor, intrigued, approached with a furrowed brow, and his expression shifted to absolute astonishment. Before we dive into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us what city you're watching from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The gymnasium of Jefferson High School buzzed with the chaotic energy of the annual Regional Science Fair. Fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across rows of display tables laden with volcano models, Sekidawa Utio Ifide, solar system dioramas, and ambitious robotics projects. The scent of fresh poster board mingled with the nervous sweat of teenagers clutching presentation notes, while teachers wandered between displays with clipboard evaluations and forced enthusiasm. Parents clustered around their children's exhibits, smartphones capturing every moment of what they hoped would be future Nobel Prize winners. Through this maze of youthful ambition walked an elderly woman, Dao Tuan Tuan Tentoen Fi, her weathered hands gripping a dark wooden cane that clicked rhythmically against the polished floor. Margaret Chen moved with deliberate slowness, her slight frame draped in a simple gray cardigan that had seen better decades. In her free arm, she carefully carried what appeared to be a small object wrapped in faded blue cloth, treating it with the reverence one might reserve for precious china. The contrast was immediate and jarring. While students displayed elaborate constructions of LEDs, motors, and gleaming metal components, Margaret's presence seemed almost anachronistic. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose bore the scratches of years of use. She moved through the crowd like a ghost from another era, drawing curious glances that quickly transformed into barely concealed amusement. "Is that somebody's grandmother?" whispered Jessica Morrison, a junior whose color-changing slime experiment sparkled under the lights. Her voice carried just far enough to reach nearby students, who turned to observe the unexpected visitor. Tyler Brooks, captain of the lacrosse team and creator of what he proudly called the ultimate paper airplane launcher, nudged his friend Connor with an elbow. "Maybe she's lost. Bingo night is probably down the hall." The snickering began as a low murmur, but gained momentum as Margaret approached the aerospace section, where student rocket models pointed skyward like miniature monuments to adolescent engineering dreams. Her destination appeared to be the last available table in this section, a corner spot that had been overlooked by the more ambitious presentations. Principal Davidson, INP Foundation Kate, a man whose perpetual smile masked a constant state of administrative anxiety, intercepted Margaret with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to redirecting confused visitors. "Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion. The Senior Center's craft show is next weekend at the Community Center." "I'm exactly where I need to be," Margaret replied, her voice carrying a quiet strength that momentarily caught him off guard. She continued toward the empty table, her cane tapping a steady rhythm that seemed to demand attention despite her modest appearance. Connor Williams, whose father owned 3 car dealerships and who had never encountered a challenge he couldn't buy his way out of, couldn't resist the opportunity for entertainment. He had spent the morning boasting about his revolutionary rocket design, a sleek model that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. The irony of an elderly woman claiming space in his domain struck him as too perfect to ignore. "Hey, Mrs. Whoever you are," Connor called out, his voice pitched loud enough to draw attention from neighboring displays. "This is the rocket section. You know, space stuff, science." He gestured broadly at his gleaming model. complete with LED guidance systems and a titanium nose cone that caught the light like a miniature SpaceX prototype. Margaret placed her wrapped object on the plane table with careful precision, then looked up at Connor with eyes that held depths he couldn't begin to fathom. "I'm aware of where I am." Tyler joined his friend, emboldened by the growing audience. "But do you even know anything about rockets? I mean, no offense, but this is pretty advanced stuff. We're talking about thrust-to-weight ratios, aerodynamic coefficients, propellant chemistry." The words that followed would echo in the gymnasium long after the fair ended, cutting through the ambient noise like a blade through silk. "You don't know anything about rockets." Connor's declaration hung in the air, followed by a burst of laughter from the gathered students. The sound was sharp and cruel, the kind of institutional mockery that transforms individual cruelty into group entertainment. Even some of the younger students, caught up in the moment, joined the laughter without fully understanding why. Margaret's hands remained steady as she began unwrapping her object, seemingly unaffected by the public humiliation unfolding around her. The cloth fell away to reveal what appeared to be a simple model rocket, constructed from what looked like cardboard and basic materials that any middle schooler might use for a weekend project. Compared to the sophisticated displays surrounding it, the model seemed almost primitive. "Oh, wow," Jessica gasped, her voice dripping with mock amazement. "Did you get that from a cereal box?" The laughter intensified, now drawing teachers and parents who craned their necks to see what was causing such a commotion. Mrs. Henderson, the chemistry teacher who had been fielding questions about her students' experiments, approached with the weary expression of someone preparing to manage another disruption. "Oh, perhaps we should find you a more appropriate section," she suggested to Margaret, her tone carrying the patronizing kindness typically reserved for confused elderly relatives at family gatherings. Margaret simply nodded toward her model, then reached into a worn leather satchel to withdraw what appeared to be sheets of yellowed paper covered in dense handwriting. The pages looked ancient, filled with calculations that spilled from margin to margin in cramped, precise notation. Numbers, symbols, and equations created patterns that resembled artwork more than homework. "These calculations," she said quietly, arranging the papers beside her model with the same careful precision she had used for the rocket itself, "took me 3 months to complete." Connor leaned closer, squinting at the papers with the confidence of someone who had aced AP Physics without truly understanding its deeper implications. "Oh, those just look like random math to me. Anyone can write numbers on paper." The dismissal was swift and absolute, but something in Margaret's demeanor began to shift. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't offer the defensive explanations that everyone expected. Instead, she simply stood beside her table, one hand resting lightly on her cane, the other touching the edge of her modest rocket model. Dr. Williams, Connor's father, who had arrived to document his son's inevitable victory, glanced at the papers with the casual interest of someone accustomed to being impressed by his own importance. "Connor's right," he declared with the authority of someone who had never been told he was wrong about anything important. "Real rocket science requires sophisticated computer modeling, wind tunnel testing, materials analysis. This looks like something from the Stone Age." The crowd was growing now, drawn by the spectacle of watching someone so clearly out of place. Margaret had become the afternoon's entertainment, a curiosity piece in a world of serious scientific endeavor. Students pulled out phones to capture what they assumed would be an amusing story to share later. Yet something about Margaret's stillness began to create an uncomfortable tension. She wasn't responding as expected. She wasn't apologizing, explaining herself, or retreating in embarrassment. She simply waited, as if she knew something that no one else had yet discovered. The wooden cane in her hand, which had initially appeared to be nothing more than a mobility aid, somehow began to take on a different significance. It stood firm against the ground, supporting not just her physical weight, but suggesting an inner strength that couldn't be easily dismissed. The way she held it spoke of years of depending on her own resources, of facing challenges that required more than expensive equipment or social approval. As the laughter finally began to fade and the crowd started to disperse, assuming the show was over, Margaret remained exactly where she was. The afternoon sun streaming through the gymnasium windows cast long shadows across the floor, and in that changing light, her simple presence began to seem less like an intrusion and more like a quiet challenge to everything everyone thought they knew about expertise, chatti age divines, and the appearance of wisdom. The dismissal should have been final. By all conventional measures, Margaret Chen had been thoroughly humiliated. Her presence at the science fair revealed as the misguided wandering of someone who had clearly overestimated her relevance. The students had returned to their own displays, parents resumed photographing their young scientists, and the rhythms of competitive academia continued their familiar patterns. But Dr. Sarah Martinez had not moved on. The aerospace engineering professor from the nearby university had been serving as a guest judge for the fair, her presence lending credibility to an event that typically showcased baking soda volcanoes and potato batteries. She stood 30 feet from Margaret's table, her attention supposedly focused on Tyler Brooks' paper airplane launcher, but her eyes kept drifting toward the yellowed papers that lay beside the simple cardboard rocket. Something in those cramped equations had caught her attention during the commotion. The brief glimpse she'd gotten suggested mathematical complexity that seemed incongruous with both the modest presentation and the public ridicule. Dr. Martinez had spent 15 years studying propulsion systems, had published papers in journals that Connor Williams couldn't pronounce, and had learned to recognize sophisticated analysis even when it appeared in unexpected forms. The thrust vectoring calculations alone would take most graduate students weeks to derive, she murmured to herself, stepping closer to Margaret's table while maintaining the pretense of examining nearby displays. Margaret noticed the approach, but continued arranging her materials with methodical patience. She had withdrawn a small notebook from her satchel, its pages filled with diagrams that showed airflow patterns around various geometric shapes. The drawings were executed with architectural precision, each line serving a specific purpose in illustrating aerodynamic principles that most high school students wouldn't encounter until advanced placement physics. "Excuse me," Dr. Martinez said, abandoning pretense and approaching directly. "Those equations you have there, are you familiar with the Tsiolkovsky rocket equation?" The question was a test, a way of gauging whether Margaret's papers contained real analysis or simply impressive-looking scribbles. The Tsiolkovsky equation was fundamental to rocket science, but not something typically known outside engineering circles. Margaret looked up from her notebook, her expression revealing nothing. The relationship between rocket mass and velocity? I prefer the expanded version that accounts for atmospheric drag and gravitational losses. The classical formulation is too simplified for practical applications. Dr. Martinez felt her professional skepticism crack. The response wasn't just correct. It demonstrated an understanding of advanced modifications that even her graduate students struggled with. She moved closer, abandoning any pretense of casual interest. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the yellowed papers. Margaret nodded, and Dr. Martinez found herself staring at calculations that made her heart rate accelerate. The mathematics was elegant and complex, showing detailed analysis of multi-stage propulsion systems with corrections for atmospheric pressure variations, temperature effects on fuel density, and three-dimensional trajectory optimization. This wasn't undergraduate work. It was the kind of analysis that required years of specialized training and practical experience. "Where did you learn to do this?" Dr. Martinez asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Necessity," Margaret replied simply, then returned to her notebook. Connor Williams, still basking in the assumed glory of his earlier triumph, noticed the professor's intense focus on Margaret's display. His confidence began to waver as he observed Dr. Martinez examining the papers with the same scrutiny she had applied to his expensive rocket model. The professor's expression had shifted from casual interest to something approaching amazement. "Is there something interesting over there?" Tyler asked, joining Connor at his elbow. Before Connor could respond, Dr. Martinez straightened up, her face showing the kind of surprise typically reserved for discovering unknown masterpieces in garage sales. She looked at Margaret with new eyes, seeing past the simple cardigan and weathered hands to something far more significant. "These calculations," Dr. Martinez said, her voice carrying across the nearby displays, "are absolutely extraordinary." The words created ripples of confusion among the students who had witnessed Margaret's earlier humiliation. Jessica Morrison looked up from her slime experiment, her expression shifting from amusement to uncertainty. Had she missed something important? Margaret seemed unsurprised by the professor's reaction. She simply nodded and reached into her satchel again, this time withdrawing what appeared to be a small electric fan and a thin candle. The objects looked like props from a magic show, completely out of place among the sophisticated equipment surrounding them. "I'd like to demonstrate something," Margaret said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that commanded attention despite its softness. Dr. Martinez stepped back, clearly eager to see what would happen next. Several students, drawn by the professor's obvious interest, began gravitating toward Margaret's table. The shift in dynamics was subtle, but unmistakable. The earlier mockery was being replaced by curiosity. Margaret placed the candle on her table and lit it with a match that she struck with practiced efficiency. The flame danced upward in the still air of the gymnasium, steady and unremarkable. She then positioned the small fan several inches away and adjusted its angle with the precision of someone conducting a delicate scientific procedure. "The principle of thrust generation," she explained, her voice remaining conversational despite the growing audience, "can be demonstrated using the simplest materials." She switched on the fan, directing its airflow across the candle flame. The flame bent away from the fan, creating a visible deflection that seemed unremarkable until Margaret began adjusting the angle and distance of the fan with minute precision. The flame's behavior changed dramatically, dancing in patterns that seemed to respond to invisible forces. "The reaction force," Margaret continued, moving her simple cardboard rocket into the airflow created by the fan, "is what propels the rocket forward. But the efficiency depends entirely on understanding how the exhaust velocity interacts with atmospheric resistance." As she spoke, her cardboard model began to move slightly on the table, responding to the controlled airflow in ways that seemed to defy its humble construction. The movement was subtle but undeniable, and it demonstrated principles of physics that Connor's expensive model, for all its titanium components and LED lights, couldn't illustrate. Tyler Brooks found himself leaning forward, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by genuine confusion. "How is it moving like that?" Margaret adjusted the fan's position again, and the model's response became more pronounced. The exhaust plume creates a pressure differential. The shape of the nozzle determines how efficiently that pressure translates into forward motion. Most people focus on the power source, but the real engineering is in managing the flow dynamics. Dr. Martinez was taking notes now, her professional excitement evident as she watched Margaret manipulate airflow with the confidence of someone who had spent decades understanding its properties. The demonstration was simple enough for high school students to follow, but sophisticated enough to illustrate principles that required graduate-level understanding to fully appreciate. Principal Davidson, drawn by the growing crowd, approached with the harried expression of someone trying to maintain order during chaos. "Is everything all right over here?" "Everything is fine," Dr. Martinez replied, her voice carrying authority that temporarily satisfied the administrator. I'm sorry. I didn't catch your name." "Chen," Margaret replied simply. Margaret Chen. The name meant nothing to most of the students, but Dr. Martinez's expression shifted again, this time showing something approaching recognition. She studied Margaret's face more carefully, as if trying to place a memory that remained just out of reach. Connor Williams, sensing that his morning of triumph was somehow slipping away, stepped forward with renewed aggression. "So you can make a candle flame move? That doesn't prove anything about real rockets. Real rocket science happens in laboratories with million-dollar equipment." Margaret looked at Connor with the patient expression of someone accustomed to young arrogance. "Real rocket science happens wherever someone understands the physics. The equipment is just tools. The understanding is what matters." She reached for another sheet of paper, this one showing detailed drawings of combustion chambers with annotations about fuel injection patterns and cooling systems. The technical sophistication was immediately apparent to Dr. Martinez, who recognized design elements that wouldn't be out of place in professional aerospace development. "This is professional-grade analysis," Dr. Martinez announced, her voice carrying across the gymnasium with academic authority. "These aren't student exercises. This is advanced engineering work." The pronouncement created a visible shift in the atmosphere around Margaret's table. Students who had been preparing to leave found themselves drawn back, their curiosity overriding their assumptions. Parents began whispering among themselves, wondering if they had missed something significant. Margaret simply nodded and continued arranging her materials, seemingly unaffected by the changing tide of opinion. Her wooden cane remained propped against the table beside her, no longer appearing as a sign of frailty, but rather as a symbol of the steady support that had carried her through whatever experiences had led to this moment. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. What had begun as public humiliation was becoming something else entirely, a gradual revelation that promised to challenge everything everyone thought they knew about expertise, age, and the appearance of knowledge. The shift in atmosphere around Margaret's table was like watching storm clouds gather on a clear day. Students who had laughed 30 minutes earlier now found themselves drawn into conversations they didn't fully understand, while parents clutched their phones, uncertain whether they were witnessing a curiosity or something genuinely significant. Dr. Martinez had positioned herself as an unofficial guardian of Margaret's demonstration, her academic credentials lending weight to observations that might otherwise be dismissed. "Mrs. Chen, these propulsion efficiency calculations, they're using computational fluid dynamics principles that weren't widely available until the 1990s. Where did you develop this methodology?" Margaret's answer came in the form of action rather than explanation. She reached into her satchel and withdrew a slide rule, its ivory surface worn smooth by decades of use. The instrument looked like an artifact from a museum, completely anachronistic in a world of graphing calculators and computer modeling software. "Before computers," Margaret said simply, adjusting the sliding scales with movements that spoke of countless hours of practice. "2. When you had to understand the mathematics because you couldn't rely on software to do the thinking for you." Connor Williams watched with growing unease as Margaret manipulated the slide rule with obvious expertise, checking calculations on her papers and making minor annotations with a mechanical pencil that looked equally ancient. The ease with which she navigated complex mathematical relationships was becoming impossible to ignore. "But slide rules are obsolete," Connor protested, his voice carrying less conviction than his words suggested. "Modern rocket design requires computer simulation, wind tunnel testing, materials analysis that you can't do with antique equipment." Margaret looked up from her calculations, her expression patient but firm. "Tools change. Physics doesn't. She turned to a fresh page in her notebook and began sketching what appeared to be a cross-sectional diagram of a rocket engine, her lines confident and precise, despite the tremor in her aged hands. As the drawing took shape, it became clear that she wasn't copying from memory, but rather designing from first principles, calculating chamber pressures and nozzle geometries with the fluidity of someone for whom such work was second nature. Jessica Morrison, whose slime experiment suddenly seemed embarrassingly simple, ventured a question that had been building in her mind. Did you work for NASA or something? The question hung in the air with particular weight, because it articulated what several people were beginning to wonder. Margaret's knowledge wasn't the product of casual interest or recent study. It demonstrated the kind of deep, practical understanding that came from professional experience. Margaret paused in her sketching, her pencil hovering over the paper as if the question had touched something sensitive. "I worked where I was needed," she said finally. Dr. Martinez, whose academic instincts were now fully engaged, pressed further. "Mrs. Chen, I have to ask, are you Dr. Margaret Chen from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory?" The name dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water, creating ripples of recognition that spread outward through the growing crowd. Dr. Martinez's expression showed dawning amazement, while several of the adults present began exchanging glances that suggested the name carried significance beyond the gymnasium. Margaret's reaction was subtle but telling. Her shoulders straightened slightly, and for a moment, the years seemed to fall away from her bearing. "I was," she said quietly. The revelation hit Connor Williams like a physical blow. Dr. Margaret Chen wasn't just any retired engineer. She was a legendary figure in aerospace development, one of the pioneering women who had contributed to missions that had defined American space exploration. Her work on propulsion systems had been fundamental to successes that Connor had grown up taking for granted. "You worked on the Mars missions," Dr. Martinez breathed, her voice filled with the kind of awe typically reserved for meeting childhood heroes. "The efficiency improvements you developed for the Viking landers, they're still used today." Margaret nodded, but her expression remained modest. "A long time ago." The understatement was staggering. Margaret Chen's contributions to rocket science had influenced decades of space exploration, her innovations saving millions in development costs while enabling missions that had expanded human knowledge of the solar system. Yet here, she stood in a high school gymnasium, having been mocked by teenagers who didn't recognize one of the most significant figures in their field of interest. Tyler Brooks felt his stomach sink as he realized the magnitude of his earlier dismissiveness. We didn't know." "You didn't ask," Margaret replied, her tone neither accusatory nor bitter, simply factual. Principal Davidson, who had been hovering at the edge of the conversation, stepped forward with the desperate enthusiasm of someone trying to transform disaster into public relations opportunity. "Dr. Chen, we're incredibly honored to have someone of your caliber at our science fair. Perhaps you'd be willing to serve as a special judge for our aerospace category." The suggestion was clearly an attempt to manage what had become an awkward situation, but Margaret's response surprised everyone. She shook her head gently but firmly. "I'm not here to judge," she said. "I'm here to participate." The distinction was crucial. Margaret wasn't positioning herself as an authority figure, looking down on student efforts. She was claiming her place as an equal participant in the scientific process. Her simple cardboard rocket and yellowed papers weren't museum pieces, but active contributions to the day's exploration of aerospace principles. Dr. Martinez understood immediately. "You're competing." "I'm sharing," Margaret corrected. "Science isn't a competition. It's a collaboration across time." She gestured toward her display, which had been transformed by context from a curious anachronism into something approaching a historical exhibit. "These calculations, this model, They represent approaches to problems that every generation has to solve again. The young people here are working on the same challenges I faced 40 years ago. Their tools are different, but the physics is identical. Connor found himself staring at Margaret's simple rocket model with new eyes. What had appeared primitive now looked elegant in its simplicity, representing a direct connection to fundamental principles that his expensive, LED-adorned model obscured rather than illuminated. Could you show us how it works?" Jessica asked, her earlier mockery replaced by genuine curiosity. Margaret smiled for the first time since arriving at the fair, the expression transforming her face and revealing glimpses of the younger woman who had once argued design principles in NASA conference rooms. "I'd be happy to." She began setting up a more elaborate demonstration, arranging her fan, candle, and rocket model with the practiced efficiency of someone who had given countless presentations to audiences both supportive and skeptical. As she worked, students and parents continued gathering, word spreading through the gymnasium that something extraordinary was happening in the corner aerospace display. Mrs. Henderson, the chemistry teacher who had earlier suggested Margaret find a more appropriate section, approached with obvious embarrassment. "Dr. Chen, I apologize for earlier. I had no idea." Margaret looked up from her preparations, her expression kind but unwavering. "The apology isn't necessary. But perhaps this is a good moment to consider why assumptions were made so quickly." The observation hung in the air, challenging everyone present to examine their own prejudices about age, appearance, and the forms that expertise could take. Margaret wasn't demanding apologies or acknowledgement. She was offering a learning opportunity that extended far beyond rocket science. As she completed her setup, the wooden cane that had supported her throughout the afternoon remained propped against her table. No longer a symbol of frailty, it had become something else entirely, a testament to the strength required to persist through decades of challenges, to continue contributing knowledge even when recognition seemed impossible. The demonstration that followed would challenge everyone's understanding not just of rocket science, but of the assumptions that shaped how they viewed knowledge, experience, and the unexpected places where wisdom could be found. The crowd around Margaret's table had grown to include nearly half the gymnasium. Word had spread through the building with the speed that only genuinely surprising news could achieve. The elderly woman who had been laughed at was actually Dr. Margaret Chen, one of the most respected figures in American aerospace engineering. Students texted friends in other sections, parents called relatives, and teachers abandoned their supervisory duties to witness what was becoming the day's central event. Margaret seemed unbothered by the attention, her focus entirely absorbed in the precise arrangement of her demonstration materials. She had transformed the simple table into what resembled a working laboratory, with her fan positioned at calculated angles, her candle providing controlled airflow visualization, and her cardboard rocket model serving as the focal point of an explanation that promised to bridge 40 years of technological advancement. "The fundamental challenge," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed gymnasium, "has never changed. We need to move mass in one direction to create motion in another. Newton's third law, basic physics. But the efficiency of that transfer, that's where the engineering happens." She lit her candle and adjusted its position with movements that spoke of muscle memory, developed through countless similar demonstrations. The flame stood steady in the still air, waiting to reveal the invisible forces that Margaret was preparing to make visible. Connor Williams stood at the edge of the crowd, his earlier confidence completely shattered. The expensive rocket model on his own table now seemed like an embarrassing display of privilege rather than achievement. Every LED, every titanium component, every computer-controlled system that he had bragged about suddenly felt hollow in the face of Margaret's simple but profound understanding. "Dr. Chen," called out Amanda Foster, a senior whose atmospheric pressure experiment had won regional competitions. "Saturtui, could you explain why your calculations are written by hand instead of using computer models?" Margaret smiled at the question, recognizing both its technical merit and its generational perspective. Computers are powerful tools, but they can also become barriers to understanding. When you calculate by hand, you feel the relationships between variables. You understand why changing one parameter affects all the others. Computers give you answers, but they don't necessarily give you insight. She activated her fan, directing its airflow across the candle flame. The flame bent away from the fan's output, creating a visible demonstration of force transfer that even the youngest students could follow. Watch the flame carefully. The air molecules are being accelerated by the fan, creating momentum in one direction. The reaction force pushes back against the fan. The demonstration was elegantly simple, but Margaret's commentary revealed layers of complexity that transformed the basic setup into a window into advanced physics. She adjusted the fan's angle by degrees, showing how small changes in exhaust direction dramatically affected the magnitude and direction of reaction forces. "Now," Margaret continued, positioning her cardboard rocket model in the controlled airflow, "the challenge becomes optimizing the transfer of momentum. The shape of the exhaust nozzle, the velocity of the ejected mass, the ambient atmospheric conditions, they all interact in ways that require mathematical analysis to predict accurately." As she spoke, her simple rocket model began responding to the airflow in ways that seemed almost magical. The cardboard tube moved across the table with controlled precision, demonstrating principles of vectored thrust and aerodynamic stability that Connor's sophisticated model, for all its advanced components, couldn't illustrate as clearly. Dr. Martinez was filming the demonstration on her phone, recognizing that she was witnessing something that belonged in engineering classrooms across the country. "The computational fluid dynamics you're showing here, this is graduate-level material presented in a way that high school students can understand." Margaret nodded while continuing to manipulate her demonstration with practiced expertise. "The mathematics becomes simple when you understand what it represents. These equations," she gestured toward her yellowed papers, "aren't abstract formulas. They're descriptions of physical reality. When you've spent enough time working with rockets, the mathematics becomes intuitive." Tyler Brooks, who had been silent since learning Margaret's identity, finally found his voice. "Dr. Chen, why did you come here today? I mean, to a high school science fair?" The question struck at something deeper than mere curiosity. Margaret paused in her demonstration, her hands still controlling the airflow around her rocket model, but her attention focused on Tyler's earnest face. "Because science isn't something that happens in isolation," she said. "Every generation builds on what came before. These experiments you're all conducting, they're asking the same fundamental questions that drove me to aerospace engineering 50 years ago. How do things move? How do forces interact? How can we use physics to solve problems?" She gestured toward the displays throughout the gymnasium, her expression encompassing everything from volcano models to solar panel arrays. Every project here represents curiosity about the natural world. That curiosity doesn't become less valuable because it's expressed through baking soda reactions or potato batteries. It's the foundation that everything else builds on. Connor felt compelled to speak, his voice tight with embarrassment. "But I said you didn't know anything about rockets." Margaret's response was gentle but unflinching. "You made an assumption based on appearance. It's a natural human tendency, but it's also a barrier to learning. Science progresses when we question assumptions, including assumptions about who might have knowledge worth sharing." The observation carried weight that extended far beyond the gymnasium. Parents in the crowd began exchanging glances that suggested recognition of broader implications. How many times had they made similar assumptions? How much knowledge had they overlooked because it didn't come packaged in expected forms? Principal Davidson, sensing an opportunity to transform what had been a potential public relations disaster into a triumph, stepped forward with renewed enthusiasm. Dr. Chen, would you be willing to give a formal presentation? We could arrange for the entire school to attend? Maybe invite the local media? Margaret shook her head with the same gentle firmness she had shown earlier. This isn't about giving presentation. It's about participating in the ongoing conversation of science. These young people don't need to hear me lecture. They need to understand that their work connects to something larger. She turned back to her demonstration, making final adjustments to show how even tiny changes in nozzle design could dramatically affect propulsion efficiency. Every rocket that's ever flown successfully has incorporated lessons learned from every rocket that came before it. Your experiments today are part of that continuous process of learning, Doctor. Martinez stepped closer to examine Margaret's calculations more closely. These optimization algorithms, some of them are techniques that we're just beginning to explore in current research. Where did you develop these approaches? Necessity, Margaret replied, echoing her earlier response but with additional context. When you're working on missions where failure isn't acceptable, you develop every analytical tool you can think of. Some of these calculations represent months of work on problems that had to be solved correctly the first time. The weight of that statement settled over the crowd. Margaret's yellowed papers weren't just academic exercises. They represented work that had enabled real spacecraft to reach real destinations, carrying the hopes and investments of entire nations. Yet, she had brought them to a high school science fair. Treating student curiosity as worthy of the same attention she had once given to multi-million-dollar space missions. As the demonstration continued, Margaret's wooden cane remained propped against her table, a quiet symbol of the strength required to persist through challenges that most people couldn't imagine. It had supported her through decades of professional obstacles, through the difficulties of being a woman in a male-dominated field, through the gradual transition from active contributor to retired observer. Now it stood as a witness to something unprecedented, a moment when accumulated wisdom met youthful curiosity in an environment where both could flourish together. The demonstration had evolved beyond simple physics education into something approaching a master class in aerospace engineering. Students from other sections had abandoned their own displays to crowd around Margaret's table, while parents found themselves furiously taking notes on concepts they hadn't encountered since their own college years. The gymnasium had transformed into an impromptu lecture hall, with Margaret as the reluctant but compelling professor. Dr. Martinez had moved beyond amazement into something approaching professional excitement. Dr. Chen, these boundary layer calculations you've shown us, they're incorporating three-dimensional flow effects that most undergraduate programs don't even attempt to address. When did you develop this analytical framework? Margaret's answer came as she continued manipulating her simple demonstration, showing how changes in surface texture affected the behavior of airflow around her cardboard model. The Apollo program. We needed to understand heat shield performance during atmospheric re-entry, which meant analyzing how gases behave at hypersonic velocities under extreme temperature conditions. The casual reference to Apollo carried the weight of historical significance that left the younger students speechless. They were witnessing explanations from someone who had contributed to humanity's greatest adventure, whose calculations had helped ensure that astronauts could return safely from the moon. You worked on Apollo? Amanda Foster's voice carried the awe of someone who had grown up seeing moon landings as ancient history. never imagining she might meet someone who had made them possible. Support work, Margaret replied with characteristic modesty. But when you're calculating thermal protection requirements, every decimal place matters. Mistakes don't just mean mission failure, they mean people don't come home. The statement hung in the air, transforming the afternoon's demonstration from an interesting diversion into something approaching sacred territory. Margaret's yellowed papers represented more than mathematical exercises. They were artifacts from moments when human lives depended on getting the calculations exactly right. Connor Williams had been struggling with emotions that he lacked the experience to process. His earlier mockery now felt not just embarrassing, but almost sacrilegious. He had ridiculed someone whose work had enabled achievements that defined American technological supremacy, whose contributions had inspired the very interests that had led him to aerospace engineering in the first place. "Dr. Chen," Connor said, his voice barely audible above the crowd's murmur, "I owe you an apology that I don't know how to give." Margaret paused in her demonstration, looking at Connor with eyes that held understanding rather than accusation. "The apology isn't what matters. What matters is what you learn from this moment." She gestured toward his elaborate rocket display, with its gleaming components and sophisticated control systems. "Your model is impressive, Connor. It represents access to materials and technologies that my generation could only dream of. But the principles that make it work, those are the same principles that governed every rocket we ever built." The observation was both generous and instructive. Rather than diminishing Connor's achievement, Margaret was placing it in context, showing how current capabilities built upon foundations laid by previous generations. Her approach transformed potential humiliation into a learning opportunity. "Could you show us how our modern approaches compare to your original methods?" Tyler asked, his earlier dismissiveness completely replaced by genuine curiosity. Margaret nodded and moved toward Connor's display, her wooden cane clicking rhythmically against the gymnasium floor. As she examined his rocket model, her expression showed professional appreciation for its sophisticated engineering. The guidance system alone represents computing power that would have filled entire buildings when I was starting my career," she observed. "But the fundamental challenge remains identical: controlling thrust vector and maintaining stable flight paths through atmospheric conditions." She pointed to specific components of Connor's model, explaining how each element addressed problems that her generation had solved using mechanical systems and analog calculations. The comparison wasn't competitive but collaborative, showing how technological advancement built upon scientific understanding that transcended any particular era. Dr. Martinez was documenting the entire exchange, recognizing its educational value for her university students. "See, this is exactly what we try to teach in our engineering ethics classes, how technological progress depends on building upon the work of previous generations rather than replacing it." Margaret returned to her own display and began showing how her hand-calculated solutions addressed the same aerodynamic challenges that Connor's computer-controlled systems managed automatically. The mathematics was more visible in her approach, requiring understanding rather than simply trusting software algorithms to provide correct answers. "The danger of advanced tools," Margaret explained, as she worked through calculations on paper while Connor's model performed similar analyses electronically, "is that they can become black boxes. You input parameters and get results, but you lose the intuitive understanding of why those results are correct." To demonstrate her point, she introduced intentionally incorrect values into her manual calculations, showing how the errors propagated through her analysis in ways that were immediately apparent to someone who understood the underlying physics. When Connor attempted the same exercise with his computer model, the sophisticated software simply refused to accept inputs that fell outside predetermined parameters. "The computer protects you from making obvious mistakes," Margaret noted, but it also prevents you from exploring the boundaries of possibility. Sometimes, the most important discoveries come from understanding why standard approaches fail under unusual conditions. The lesson extended far beyond rocket science into broader questions about the relationship between human understanding and technological capability. Margaret was demonstrating that sophisticated tools could enhance human knowledge, but should never replace the fundamental curiosity and analytical thinking that drove scientific advancement. Jessica Morrison, whose slime experiment had been forgotten in the afternoon's excitement, ventured a question that had been building in her mind. Dr. Chen, do you think we're losing something important by relying so heavily on computers for scientific work? Margaret considered the question carefully, her expression suggesting that it touched on concerns she had wrestled with throughout her later career. We're gaining tremendous capability, but we may be losing some aspects of intuitive understanding. The challenge is learning to use advanced tools while maintaining the curiosity and analytical thinking that make those tools meaningful. She gestured toward the various displays throughout the gymnasium, encompassing everything from simple chemical reactions to complex robotics projects. Every experiment here represents someone asking, "What if?" and then finding ways to explore that question. That fundamental curiosity is what drives all scientific progress, regardless of whether the exploration happens with slide rules or supercomputers. The observation resonated with students and parents alike, suggesting that the afternoon's events carried implications beyond aerospace engineering. Margaret was articulating a philosophy of learning that emphasized understanding over mere technological facility, curiosity over access to sophisticated equipment. As the crowd around her table continued to grow, Margaret's wooden cane remained a constant presence, leaning against her display with quiet dignity. It had supported her through decades of professional challenges, through the evolution of her field from mechanical calculations to computer modeling, through the transition from active contributor to elder observer of scientific progress. Now it stood as a symbol of persistence, of the enduring value of accumulated wisdom, and of the bridge between generations of scientists who shared common goals despite working with vastly different tools. The afternoon's demonstration was revealing not just technical knowledge, but the deeper principles that connected past achievements to future possibilities. Word of Margaret's presence had spread beyond the gymnasium. Local news reporter Sarah Kim arrived with a cameraman. Having received a tip about something extraordinary happening at the Jefferson High Science Fair. Margaret's reaction to the news crew was characteristically understated. "I'm not here to be interviewed," she said quietly. "I'm here to participate in the science fair." The reporter's presence intensified attention, but Margaret continued positioning herself as an active participant rather than distinguished guest. Dr. Robert Hayes from the Engineering College and City Councilwoman Patricia Wong found themselves drawn into the crowd surrounding Margaret's display. "Dr. Chen," Dr. Hayes said with obvious respect, "I've assigned your papers on multi-stage propulsion optimization in my graduate courses for years." Margaret redirected attention toward the students. "These young people are working on similar optimization problems right now. Perhaps they'd benefit more from comparing their approaches to current research than hearing about work I did decades ago." Amanda Foster, emboldened by Margaret's encouragement, began explaining her atmospheric pressure experiment with renewed confidence. "I found some unexpected results that don't match what the textbook predicted." Margaret listened intently. Unexpected results are often the most valuable. They tell you there's something important happening that standard models don't account for. Rather than providing answers, Margaret encouraged Amanda to explore questions more deeply, transforming initial confusion about anomalous data into excitement about potentially significant discoveries. Connor Williams approached with new respect. "Dr. Chen, would you be willing to look at my rocket design? Not to judge it, but to help me understand what questions I should be asking about it. Margaret's smile showed appreciation for how Connor framed his request. The conversation revealed the sophistication of his engineering choices, but also highlighted unexamined assumptions. "Why did you choose titanium for the nose cone?" Margaret asked. "Because it's strong and lightweight," Connor replied, then paused. "But I guess I didn't calculate whether the strength was actually necessary for the forces this rocket will encounter." "That's a good observation," Margaret noted. "Over-engineering can be as problematic as under-engineering. Understanding actual requirements helps you make better choices about where to invest resources." Dr. Martinez was documenting these exchanges with growing excitement about their pedagogical value. Margaret was demonstrating teaching approaches that transformed student work from performance evaluation into genuine scientific inquiry. Mrs. Henderson approached with curiosity about Margaret's teaching methods. "Dr. Chen, how do you decide what questions to ask students?" Margaret's response revealed decades of thinking about education. "I try to ask questions that I genuinely want to know the answers to. Students can tell the difference between questions that test their knowledge and questions that explore genuine curiosity." Tyler Brooks contemplated the afternoon's revelations. "Dr. Chen, do you think there are other people like you, with incredible knowledge and experience, who we overlook because they don't look like what we expect experts to look like?" Margaret's answer was both gentle and pointed. "Every day, knowledge and wisdom accumulate in many forms, often in people whose contributions aren't immediately obvious. The question isn't whether such people exist, it's whether we're curious enough to recognize them." The statement resonated throughout the crowd, challenging everyone to examine assumptions about expertise, authority, and the forms that valuable knowledge could take. As the afternoon progressed, Margaret's wooden cane continued standing beside her table, its significance evolving with each interaction. It had been transformed from apparent frailty into a symbol of strength, persistence, and the support required to carry accumulated wisdom through decades of challenges. Now it represented the bridge between generations of knowledge, enabling Margaret to remain standing while sharing insights with young people who would carry scientific inquiry forward into an uncertain future. Her presence was revealing not just technical expertise, but the deeper values that made scientific progress possible: curiosity, humility, persistence, and the generosity required to share knowledge across generational boundaries. The gymnasium had transformed from a typical science fair into something approaching a scientific symposium. University professors mingled with students while parents engaged in technical discussions they never could have imagined. Margaret remained at the center, her simple display serving as the focal point for conversations ranging from basic physics to cutting-edge aerospace research. Dr. Martinez's phone calls bore fruit when Dr. James Patterson arrived from NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. His appearance created excitement, but his focus remained entirely on Margaret. "Dr. Chen," he said with reverence, "I've been hoping to meet you for years. Your work on thermal protection systems influenced design decisions we're still using today." Margaret's response was characteristically modest. That work belonged to entire teams. Individual contributions become meaningful only when they connect to larger effort. Dr. Patterson pressed forward. "Would you share insights about current Mars mission challenges? The thermal dynamics during atmospheric entry are creating problems that remind me of issues you solved during the Viking program." Margaret agreed, but with a surprising condition. "I'd be happy to discuss those challenges, but I'd like these students to participate. The problems you're describing require fresh perspectives, and young minds often see solutions that experienced engineers miss." What followed was extraordinary, a technical discussion between NASA professionals and high school students, facilitated by Margaret, addressing real challenges facing current space exploration. Margaret's role wasn't to provide answers, but to translate between professional concerns and student curiosity, creating bridges that enabled genuine collaboration. Connor Williams contributed observations about computer modeling that helped Dr. Patterson understand new analytical approaches. Amanda Foster's pressure variation experience provided atmospheric dynamics insights. Tyler Brooks asked material property questions that opened new investigation lines. "This is remarkable," Dr. Patterson observed. "We spend millions on consulting contracts, but we rarely have access to this kind of unconstrained intellectual curiosity." Margaret redirected credit toward the students. Curiosity isn't constrained by credentials. Sometimes the most important questions come from people who aren't already committed to standard approaches. Teachers brought entire classes to observe. CTVU Sinadridi, recognizing their students were witnessing education in its purest form, knowledge being created through collaborative exploration rather than transmitted from authority figures to passive recipients. Principal Davidson had given up managing normal activities. "Dr. Chen, would you consider establishing ongoing relationship with our school? Perhaps a visiting researcher program?" Margaret's answer revealed her educational philosophy depth. "I don't think special programs are necessary. Science fairs already provide perfect opportunities for knowledge sharing across generations. The question is whether we recognize those opportunities when they appear." Dr. Hayes had been documenting interactions for engineering education journals. "Dr. Chen, what you've demonstrated challenges fundamental assumptions about knowledge transfer between experienced professionals and emerging scientists. Have you developed these teaching methods intentionally?" Margaret revealed decades of thinking about education. "I learned early that the most important discoveries often came from conversations with people who approached problems from different perspectives. These young people aren't constrained by professional orthodoxy. They're willing to consider possibilities that experienced engineers might dismiss automatically." Tyler Brooks asked the question troubling him all afternoon. "Dr. Chen, why did you come here today? Really? Why choose a high school science fair when you could be consulting with NASA or teaching at universities?" Margaret's answer went to the heart of everything that had occurred. "Because this is where the future is being shaped. Every space mission launching 20 years from now will be designed by people who are students today. If I want to contribute to that future, I need to engage with the people who will create it." She paused, looking around at displays ranging from simple reaction to sophisticated robotics. "But more than that, I came because I wanted to remember what it feels like to be excited about learning for its own sake, without worrying about grants or publications. Science fairs preserve that pure curiosity that originally drew most of us to technical fields." Jessica Morrison found courage to approach directly. "Dr. Chen, do you think my project is worthless compared to all this rocket science discussion?" Margaret's response was immediate and emphatic. "Absolutely not. Your experiment demonstrates the same curiosity and systematic investigation that drives all scientific progress. The specific subject matter is less important than your commitment to understanding how the natural world works." As Jessica explained her pH indicator investigation, Margaret asked questions revealing connections between polymer chemistry and spacecraft materials, science, demonstrating that no scientific inquiry was isolated. Margaret's wooden cane remained propped against her table, having supported her through hours of standing and explaining. It had become a symbol not just of physical support, but of accumulated strength required to persist through decades while maintaining enthusiasm necessary to share knowledge with future generations. The day's revelations had transformed everyone's understanding not just of Margaret's expertise, but of unexpected places where wisdom could be found, and extraordinary educational opportunities existing within ordinary community events. As the official science fair judging concluded, Principal Davidson abandoned normal procedures and declared this year's event would be remembered for demonstrating the true spirit of scientific inquiry and intergenerational collaboration. Connor Williams approached the microphone with obvious nervousness. I want to apologize publicly to Dr. Chen for my behavior earlier today. But more than that, I want to thank her for showing all of us that real expertise isn't about having the most expensive equipment. It's about understanding fundamental principles and being willing to share that understanding with others. Margaret's response focused on broader lessons rather than personal acknowledgement. Connor's apology isn't necessary, but his recognition of learning opportunities is exactly the kind of thinking that will make him an excellent engineer. Dr. Martinez had arranged for several graduate students to attend. Recognizing the educational value of Margaret's teaching methods, what we've observed here should be studied and replicated across the country. Dr. Chen has demonstrated that powerful learning occurs when experienced knowledge meets youthful curiosity in environments that encourage genuine intellectual exchange. Mrs. Henderson, representing the teaching staff, Cedar Fiends, Dalinsi Light, spoke about restructuring science curriculum to incorporate more inquiry-based approaches. Dr. Chen has shown us that students learn most effectively when they're treated as collaborators in discovery, rather than recipients of predetermined information. Margaret's response was both supportive and cautionary. Changing educational approaches requires teachers willing to ask questions they don't know the answers to, administrators who support intellectual risk-taking, and communities that value understanding over test scores. Dr. Patterson announced that NASA would establish a program connecting retired engineers with current students and researchers. Dr. Chen has demonstrated the incredible value of bridging generational knowledge gaps. Margaret remained concerned about institutionalizing approaches that worked best when emerging naturally. Programs can create opportunities, but they can't create the openness and humility that make real learning possible. Those qualities have to be cultivated individually. Students began sharing reflections on how the day had influenced their thinking. Amanda Foster spoke about gaining confidence to trust her observations even when they challenged expectations. Tyler Brooks discussed learning to ask questions that explored genuine curiosity. Jessica Morrison explained how conversations with Margaret had helped her understand connections between her simple experiment and broader scientific principles. The most moving moment came when Connor presented Margaret with a gift from all participating students. A simple wooden rocket carved by the woodworking class, incorporating design elements from both Margaret's cardboard model and the students' sophisticated creations. "And we wanted to give you something that represents what you've taught us," Connor explained, "that the most important engineering happens in understanding principles, not using expensive materials, and that the best discoveries come from combining different approaches and perspectives." Margaret accepted the gift with visible emotion. "This is beautiful, but the most valuable gift you can give me is your commitment to maintaining the curiosity and openness you've shown today." As Margaret packed her materials with methodical care, Dr. Martinez approached. "Dr. Chen, would you speak at our university's commencement ceremony next spring?" Margaret's answer reflected her philosophical consistency. "I'd be happy to participate, but not as a keynote speaker delivering prepared remarks. Perhaps we could arrange a dialogue format where graduating students could ask questions about challenges they'll face. Real learning happens through conversation, not through listening to speeches." Connor helped Margaret carry her materials to the parking lot, an act of service that felt like both apology and commitment. "Dr. Chen, will we see you at next year's science fair?" Margaret's smile suggested possibilities without making commitments. "Science happens every day, Connor. The question isn't whether we'll have opportunities to learn from each other, it's whether we'll recognize those opportunities when they appear." As Margaret's car disappeared into the afternoon traffic, the gymnasium slowly returned to normal appearance, but the transformation was permanent. Students had learned that expertise could appear in unexpected forms, that genuine learning required intellectual humility, and that important discoveries emerged from collaborative exploration across generational boundaries. Margaret Chen had arrived as an apparently confused elderly woman who didn't know anything about rockets. She departed as Dr. Margaret Chen, aerospace engineering pioneer, but more significantly, as someone who had demonstrated that profound education occurred when experienced wisdom met youthful curiosity in environments encouraging genuine intellectual exchange. The wooden cane that had supported her throughout the day remained a symbol of strength required to persist through decades of challenges while maintaining the generosity necessary to share knowledge with future generations. Her presence had revealed not just technical expertise, but deeper values that made scientific progress possible: curiosity, humility, persistence, 处处以duan, and commitment to building bridges across boundaries that too often separated accumulated knowledge from emerging potential. If this story of unexpected wisdom and intergenerational learning resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever encountered someone whose expertise surprised you because it didn't come in the package you expected? Please like this story if Margaret's journey from dismissal to recognition inspired you, and subscribe for more narratives that explore how authentic human connections can transform our understanding of learning and expertise. Share this with someone who might need a reminder that knowledge and dignity exist in many forms, often hidden in plain sight, waiting for communities curious enough to recognize their value.